Oh, hey guys, so I've come to a conclusion. I've decided to get rid of all my games that don't require any true gaming skill. Okay, so here's all the stacks that I plan on getting rid of, and then this is the one that may push the challenging mark, because at the end of the day, if it's challenging enough, I don't really need anything else. Nope. Nothing else. This one game. You know, I remember 3D Dot Heroes being hard, Super Mario 3D Land, okay, can't forget about Games are one of the most interesting forms of media. While movies, TV shows, and books take the spotlight when talking about entertainment, video games have something that those don't, and that's input. Games allow us to have direct inputs to the experience in a way that movies and books just can't. Anyone can watch a movie or read a book, but most of the time those experiences are going to be the same as someone else who might have seen that movie or read that book. However, video games allow us to put our own swing on how a character might react to a situation, or how you might get to the flagpole at the end of that level. But damn it, sometimes it's really hard to reach that flagpole. Difficulty in games is one of the most defining parts of them. Difficulty can make a game memorable, fun, hard, impossible, great, bad, and even garbage. Some games might have a set difficulty, like any Mario game. Some might have several optional difficulties, like Mass Effect 2, and some might have ranking systems, like modern Sonic games. In this day and age, developers have a solid understanding of what difficulty for their game should be when envisioning their final product. But difficulty in games wasn't always as defined as they are today. Nowadays, gaming difficulty is intertwined with the experience, but back in the 80s, difficulty had a different motivation behind it. Exploiting the masses! Gaming during the arcade years was all about how many quarters can be sucked out of the player. The games during this time were built with the intent for difficulty to start out fairly easy, but very addictive. Then, after a level or two, ramp it up so that the game is so hard that it is impossible to beat. Pac-Man has to be the magnum opus of this difficulty design. I mean, you have one level that is the same gameplay, but small things are increased to make the level following the previous harder. Ghosts get faster and trickier, and after a certain level, the power pellets just stop doing anything. If you're god tier enough to even reach the legendary level 256, half the screen doesn't even work. This level, also known as the kill screen for those Pac-Man aficionados out there, is actually confirmed by Namco that back in the day, the level was glitched, and instead of fixing it, they decided to keep it as the final level, so it was actually impossible to complete the game. This type of difficulty design was all over arcade machines at the time. Tons and tons of games were simply meant for sucking quarters out of people's pockets, and everyone thought it was the greatest thing ever since sliced bread. Oh, yeah! After the NES release, the focus shifted from how much someone can play of a game to how long does it take to beat it. You see, NES cartridges could hold maybe 1/16 of what an arcade cabinet could, so the developers needed to take these small games and drag them out. So as a result, there are some really hard games for this system. Like, most people look back on the NES with the mindset of, oh, this is how the game should be made, not this modern day trash. But honestly, have you gone back to play some of these games recently? They're very unforgiving in their difficulty level. Arguably the most unforgiving NES game was Ghosts and Goblins. Enemy placements are just plain awful, and damage dished out versus damage taken is severely unbalanced. This game is so brutal that if you beat the game with any weapon other than the shield, it says, sorry, you gotta go back and try it again. And then if you beat the game with the shield, it says that you have to go back and beat it a second time with even more enemies horribly placed throughout the levels. So basically if I had to choose between Chinese water torture and Ghosts and Goblins, water's not that bad. But as time went on, the difficulty design shifted from just filling the game with as much shit as possible to, wait, I can actually finish this game? Yes, developers began to shift their focus to replayability and enjoyment, as those two things were what were moving games. See, for the longest time people just looked at box art of a game and said, oh, that looks fun, and then when you got home, you began to ask if it was too late to take the game back. However, with the birth of the internet, people began to discuss what games were actually fun versus what someone in a magazine said was fun. Because word of mouth traveled faster, companies saw that scaling back games' difficulty and making games more accessible to general audiences was just the way to go. Super Mario 64 has to be a great example of this. This game has one set difficulty, but that doesn't make it easy. The game starts out with a big open field so that you can get used to its controls, and then you jump into the first set of levels for you to find whichever stars you want in whichever order that you want to. As the game continues, the jumps become more precise, and the enemies get tougher, but nothing feels unachievable. You can just get the base 75 stars, or you can go for the full 120. It's all up to you. Sure, it may be hard at points, but because of Mario's versatility and leaving much of the level progression to the player, the difficulty never feels unfair or unbalanced like Ghosts and Goblins does. So for me, this fixed difficulty is kind of the sweet spot. Usually it opens up more discussion with others because we're starting and ending in the same spot, but other games don't really take this approach to their difficulty setting. So what's better than putting the work in to make sure that the difficulty of your game is perfected? By just scaling it under some stupidly vague labels. Most games that use this system of choice typically just scale the enemy health and damage. Skyrim has to be one of the biggest examples of this. You're given the choice of 6 different difficulties, with not much explanation as to what the differences between them are. With games as big as Skyrim, they usually will just change the damage dealt to and by the player. So if I'm being completely honest, yeah, I don't like that. So before you hardcore difficulty scalers get mad at me, remember, I'm the guy who doesn't like Metroid Prime's controls. You really think my opinion matters? My biggest problem with this difficulty design is that it makes the combat harder, sure, but the rest of the game is almost completely untouched. In certain games like Halo, where combat is the driving force, this difficulty scaling makes sense. But in larger titles like Skyrim, I always wanted just a little bit more, like making the conversations with NPCs much harder or upping the level for stealing stuff. But Skyrim isn't the only game that suffers from this issue. Mass Effect 2 has to be one of my favorite games ever made. Those games have some of the best storytelling in gaming, but just like Skyrim, changing the difficulty will only change how strong the NPCs are, along with making their aim better and using more options while attacking, like biotics and powers. I can't help but wish that the Mass Effect series would have implemented the difficulty changes into the Paragon and Renegade choices instead of just the combat. I know that bringing stories and character decisions over the 3-game series was the main focus, and good on them for that being the case, as truly the story is the main focus. But something as simple as choice scaling would have added a lot for replayability's sake. However, either way, it's a small price to pay when the player gets to dictate their level of enjoyment. It's super interesting to see how difficulty has changed over the years, starting out with monetization, going to prolongation, and ending with just making sure it's an enjoyable experience. But good thing we never went back to NES difficulty, right? So for a while there, games were getting easy. Some would say too easy. Companies were starting to put less and less effort into their difficulty design by just scaling enemies. But then, out of the shadows, a new game caught the industry by storm. Dark Souls single-handedly revamped what difficulty meant in video games. I mean, Demon Souls did it first, but Dark Souls is where it got popular. This game took it back to the old-school NES playground and pummeled its players into the ground. During this time, the industry had become over-fixated with appealing to the casual gamers, and we got such relentlessly hard titles like Skyward Sword and Super Mario 3D Land. I like these titles a lot. They're great games, but the toughest part of Skyward Sword was making sure that the controllers actually worked. So thank God for Dark Souls coming through and showing us that it was okay to make games challenging. Dark Souls does not let up. The first boss is just as hard as future bosses, and the game gives you no tutorial on how to beat it. The game drops you in and says, alright, now go on. There you go. Dark Souls is very much so a learn-as-you-go experience, with NPCs and game descriptions giving next to no help on how to defeat the enemies in the game. There's a strong lack of communication from the game to the player here. Now, this necessarily wouldn't be bad, as information is so accessible in this day and age. Anyone can just look up a walkthrough online, check out the insane online community that this game has made, or if you're Amish or Kevin, you can buy a strategy guide. But for me personally, I don't like breaking my concentration from a game while playing it. I told you not to bother me while I'm playing video games! A lot of this game's challenge comes from not telling the player where to go or what to do. It feels like the developers intended for the community to discuss their findings online and to figure everything out that way. But for me, having to lean on outside information really pulls me out of the game. Dark Souls was going for the same vibe as The Legend of Zelda on the NES, a big world for you to walk around and discover with little to no info on where to head next. For me, this exploration is much more enjoyable without the assistance of the internet, but props to the devs for wanting to make the community thrive via discovering the game together. But Kevin, I hear you say people don't really care about the communication in Dark Souls. Talk about what really matters. Okay, it's time to get to what Dark Souls is known for. Okay, so let's be honest, when the difficulty of this game is brought up, 2 things are brought up, either the lack of communication or the combat. The lack of communication part I've heard arguments about, but for me, it's more about just running around and discovering the world, as I said earlier. Now, the combat, on the other hand, is just perfect. This game just nails its combat. I said that it was closer to NES difficulty earlier, and I may have jumped the gun with that statement. The game is hard, don't get me wrong, but NES games are more about impossible jumps and random bullshit all over your screen, whereas Dark Souls is more about patience. You have to spend some serious time in the combat just waiting and learning how to defeat your enemies, and when you take your time, you are seriously rewarded for that patience. And that alone pushed the design difficulty of the industry towards a new focus, that focus being engagement. Dark Souls focused so hard on pulling your engagement in with these boss fights, trying to figure out how they worked, maybe finding something new that would assist you with fighting the boss and make it easier for you. This made developers shift focus entirely for how they design their boss fights and other parts of their game in general. Games today work so hard to keep the player engaged with their fights through their difficulty, and if it's done right, it works so well. Even if a game like Dark Souls has some crazy steep difficulty in its boss fights, I'll always feel determined to beat the game as long as it feels like it is within my reach. And that's a pretty amazing feeling when overcoming that difficult fight. It's crazy to see how the evolution of gaming difficulty has changed over the years from pure monetary intent to staying engaged through those difficult fights. While I may not like the stress of having to decipher what difficulty works for me, for many it gives them stairs of growth, one step after another to defeating the hardest challenge that the game can throw at them, and that journey is amazing for anyone when playing a game. I'll always prefer my Mario 64s to my Halos in terms of the difficulty, but that doesn't mean that those are bad, far from it. If the game is too hard, there's no shame in changing that difficulty. And games like Dark Souls may be brutally hard and require a lot of patience, but at least you can overcome them with hard work and determination. It's not locked behind some paywall or having to pay to actually be able to get the gear to actually beat the boss. Could you imagine if that was in the industry these days? Ugh.
Jimmy, I just got the best idea for our games from a casino!